Good evening. It is May 29th. We are so fortunate to welcome the author of In the Shadow of Greenbrier. And I can't wait to ask her questions. And she's got pictures for us. And this is through the Jewish Book Council. Yay, Jewish Book Council. So I really enjoyed the book. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about Emily. Emily, during this time, I usually show your picture, but everyone can see Emily. And that's what she looks like. So she's a writer and author originally from North Carolina, so it's in the South. And this is her debut novel, In the Shadow of Greenbrier. In the Shadow of Greenbrier, a multi-generational saga about a Jewish family living near the iconic Greenbrier Resort in West Virginia. And it was published last year. And she's also a journalist, and she has nonfiction books, which you can tell us about. But I've already told Emily, you have to go to Wikipedia because she went to Harvard,
Oh,
which is not on her website. And although, I know Harvard, it's been a day for Harvard this past couple of months. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, the New Republic, Gourmet, and Outside, among others. When she's not working, she likes to hike, cook, garden, try new foods, and travel with her husband and two sons. So, without any further ado, Emily, take it away.
hi Vanessa, and hi everybody else. Thank you so much for having me. It's really nice to be here. I um I was saying I've got a short presentation that's going to show some pictures, and I think it's nice to help get everyone situated visually. Now, I want to ask, so you guys are near Chicago, yeah, outside Chicago.
Yes.
Um, have any of you been to the Greenbrier?
No.
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 Yeah, it's a fair distance from where you are. But let me pull up this presentation I have. Oh, Vanessa, could you just
Oh, right, right, right.
allow
I
me
have to
to?
make you up. I do want to say, Emily, that I kind of want to go and see it now.
Well, I will tell you, it is an interesting place. It's not the full luxury that it was back in the middle of the 20th century, but it is still a very wild and very interesting place.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Can everybody see my presentation now?
Yes.
Yeah. Wow, look at that.
Um, so a little bit of, before I get into the background of the Greenbrier, let me just give you a little bit of background on how I came to learn about the Greenbrier and how I decided to write this book. And if at any point anyone can't hear me, just shout at me, please. Um,
And also Emily's going to talk. If you have questions, you can put them in the chat. But we will have time for Q&A.
Great. So I like Vanessa said, I'm from North Carolina, and after college, I was living back in my hometown and I was working at a small newspaper. And I had a friend at the newspaper who was also in her 20s, and we were single and didn't have any particular responsibilities. And one week she said, "Hey, do you want to take a road trip this weekend?" And I said, "Sure. Where do you want to go?" And she said, "How about West Virginia?" And I said, "Sure, why not?" I didn't know really anything about what there was to see or do. But we hopped in the car. This was around 2005 maybe, and we drove up to West Virginia and we did some hiking, and then we're staying in a motel that night, and I'm looking around on Google to see if there was anything else that we could see before we drove back home. And on Google, I read about this resort called the Greenbrier and this special tour that you could take. And now I know, maybe some of you have read the book and some of you haven't yet, but if some of you haven't and are planning to, I'm going to withhold what the tour is about because it's a little bit of a plot point in the book. And I think it's fun, even though it is part of the historical record. If you don't know about it, it's fun to discover that way, I think.
I think, listen, Emily, they should have read the book
Okay,
because it was
well,
assigned and we may have questions about that plot point, but go ahead.
um, Well, so the tour is of the part of the hotel that was a secret. The nuclear the bunker that was designed for Congress that was hidden under the West Virginia wing for more than 3 decades. And now that it's decommissioned, you can take a tour. And I thought that sounded absolutely wild, and we had to do it. So we drove up to the Greenbrier, which is sort of in the middle of nowhere. And all of a sudden, we're driving down the lane, and this resort reveals itself to us, and it's like, it looks like the White House, but 3 times bigger, right there in the middle of the Allegheny Mountains, just beautiful and shining. And we went and we took the tour, and the tour guide was a local of White Sulphur Springs, which is the town where the Greenbrier is, and she said something on the tour that just really stuck in my mind. And I'll tell you what that is in a second. But first, I want to show you some of the slides of the Greenbrier. What she told me was really stuck in my mind so much that when I was done with the tour, I said to my friend, I want to write a novel about this one day. And it took me about 15 years to get started, but eventually I did it. And that's how I came to know about this place, which, as it turns out, was a popular summer destination for probably plenty of people that I grew up near, but it wasn't a place. My Jewish family in Durham did not vacation at the Greenbrier, so I'd never heard of it. But like I said, the Greenbrier, it's in White Sulphur Springs, which is on the border of Virginia, and it's not very far from Washington, D.C. It's only a couple hours. There's a direct train, and there has been for a very long time. The place itself, it's been a destination since the late 1700s, since before America was even a country. People started visiting because it had these natural springs, and they said that the water was healthy, that it could cure your rheumatism, your tuberculosis. So people started coming up there in the summers and staying in cottages. And pretty quickly it became the real see and be seen summer spot for upper class Southerners. If you were a factory owner in Memphis or Atlanta, or you had a plantation in Alabama, you didn't want to spend the summer at home because A, it was hot and there wasn't any air conditioning, and B, the heat meant there was lots of mosquitoes, and those mosquitoes carried diseases. Of course, they may not have known that that's how the diseases were transmitted, but all they knew was that there was malaria and yellow fever in places like Memphis in the summer, and that going to a higher altitude seemed to make it better. So people who could afford it would take off, and they would go up to the mountains in West Virginia to the Greenbrier for the entire summer season. And they would have balls, and they would have, courting events for the single young men and women, and lots of matches were made. And by 1913, the property had been bought by the railroad, and they built what we now recognize as the modern Greenbrier. That opened in 1913, looking fairly much like this photograph, which I think is actually from the 1930s. I'm going to come back there. And everyone who was anyone in the 20th century stayed at the Greenbrier, not just the rich factory owners, but celebrities, royalty, lots of politicians. You can see I've put in a few presidents. I think you see JFK, you see maybe Nixon is in there. There's Bush the senior. Those are just a few, because I believe more than half of the presidents have stayed at the Greenbrier. You had, there's Debbie Reynolds and Eddie Fisher in the middle. They spent part of their honeymoon at the Greenbrier. Right next to them, that's Princess Grace of Monaco, Judy Garland, really all sorts of people. It was an incredibly glamorous place. On the right, you've got the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, who had their own private suite. In fact, it didn't belong to them, but it was the place where they would go. They would have this suite that was 7 rooms, and it's the staircase to their suite that is on the cover of my book. So then in 1942, something strange happened, which was that, in 1941, in December 1941, Pearl Harbor happens. All of a sudden, America's at war, and then Washington, D.C. has an unusual problem, which is that they have all of these diplomats, these German diplomats, Italian diplomats, Japanese, who are now officially enemies, but you can't put diplomats and their families and children in an ordinary prison. So they had to figure out where to put them. And the manager of the Greenbrier, having a long-standing relationship with many politicians in Washington, he got a call, and he was asked if he could do a favor for the US government. And the favor was, could he close his very glamorous hotel and reopen it as essentially a luxury prison for Nazi and Italian and Japanese diplomats? And he said yes. Not everyone was happy about that decision, but he would say that he thought that it was his patriotic duty to do what the government had asked. So at the end of 1941, I believe it was the end of 1941, the trains started arriving full of diplomats and their families and their, you know, their hat boxes and their furs, and they were put in the same beautiful hotel rooms as any other Greenbrier guests, and the most senior diplomats got the big suites, and they basically used the hotel as if they were ordinary guests. They swam in the pool, they had massages, they had their meals in the splendid Greenbrier dining room. They even, apparently in April of 1942, used the dining room to host a special dinner party to celebrate the birthday of Adolf Hitler, which did not well please many of the Greenbrier workers. So this is a sort of an odd time for the Greenbrier, obviously. It doesn't last for very long. It's about 6 months that it's a luxury prison, and then they're finally able to figure out how to repatriate these diplomats. Now, after that, it became an army hospital for the rest of the war. And then after that, in 1946, they hired a New York decorator called Dorothy Draper, who would really become a 20th century icon. She's done some of the grand hotels in places like Palm Beach. And she redid the Greenbrier to what you see now. This sort of very colorful, very maximalist look. Flower patterns everywhere, these chartreuse greens and melon pinks and yellows and clashing patterns and these big stripes, which you sometimes hear referred to as Draper stripes. And this was considered a very, very daring, sort of very edgy, very cool look at the time. And when she was finished, they reopened with a big 3-day gala, and everybody came, all the politicians, all of the Hollywood people, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor were there, and it reopened with a bang. And the war was over. It's it's now, the resort's going gangbusters. The American economy is doing great. It's the late 40s. Now it's the 50s. And then in 1958, the manager gets another call from Washington, D.C., and Washington has another favor to ask. And the favor is to build the facility I referenced, the secret facility underneath the new wing of the hotel that would house Congress in the event of a nuclear disaster. He said this would need to be done in absolute secrecy. The manager agreed. He said his workers could be trusted. He said the townspeople could be trusted. And he was essentially right, because this stayed a secret officially for more than 30 years. And when it was revealed in the Washington Post in the early 90s, it was not because anyone in the Greenbrier, anyone in White Sulphur Springs had talked about it. It was because somebody in Washington, D.C. decided to reveal it for some specific political reasons. So just going back to what I said earlier about the tour guide and what she had said that had inspired me so much, it was that she said, look, I was growing up in the 50s in White Sulphur Springs, and we all knew that the official story about what they were building, which was that it was just another wing for the hotel, we all knew that was nonsense. We saw them bring in 100 urinals. We saw them build a foundation that was absurdly deep. We saw the amount of concrete that they put in there. And anyone with half a brain put it together. You know, we didn't know exactly. We thought maybe it was for the president, but we knew. But we also knew that it was our duty to not talk about it, that this was an important thing we were being basically trusted with, and that we kept that secret. And I thought that was so wild, the idea of a whole town keeping a secret for 3 decades, and how that could never happen today. You know, it would be on TikTok in like a minute, right? And I was really inspired by the idea of secret keeping, and so that was what inspired me. That was the initial seed of the book. Now, of course, the characters and all of that would come later, and if anyone has questions about that, I would be more than happy to answer that, or questions about, you know, Jewish community in West Virginia, in Appalachia, or anything else. But I did want to give you that little history of the Greenbrier because it is just such a fascinating and truly weird place.
It's really, Jesse asked, let me put up the chat.
A typo, sorry.
That's okay. Now I think, you know, Jack or Giacomo in the a story that you said, where did they go after the Greenbrier?
Yeah.
Yeah, so when they needed to detain the diplomats, there were 3 hotels that were called upon that were all very grand, long-standing Southern resort hotels. One of them was the Greenbrier. One of them was the Homestead, which is about an hour from the Greenbrier in Virginia. And one of them was the Grove Park, which is in Asheville, North Carolina. And so what had happened was some of the diplomats that had been at the Greenbrier were then sent on. I believe it was all the Italians, or most of the Italians were sent on from the Greenbrier down to the Grove Park in Asheville, and they were replaced by the Japanese contingent. So there was some moving around.
Okay. I have tons of questions, but if anybody, I'll let you all go first, and then I'll come in. I thought it was, wait, go ahead, then I'll. Okay. I thought it was a compelling story. I thought that seeing everything through women's issues, you know, whether it was getting pregnant, trying Sylvia trying to abort the baby, you know, all of that really rang. You know, I don't know if it was true. I mean, I'm too young for that, but you know, it just makes you think about, you know, how things happen today and what's happening with the Jewish community. Was any of that based on family, fact, any of the stories in the book?
So none of the storyline is based on anyone in my family, but I will say the character of Sylvia, a lot of her biographical details are lifted from my own grandmother. And if you can see behind me, you can
I
see
was
the,
wondering, yeah, I see
yeah,
the pictures.
that's my grandmother Evelyn, and she was from the city of Łódź in central Poland, which is the same town that Sylvia comes from in the story. And she was also from a pretty, you know, upper middle class family. Her father owned some kind of textile factory. They were very assimilated. They, you know, had a very nice life and did not think they needed to leave, did not want to leave until almost too late. Not quite as late as Sylvia and her family left it, but by the time they left, they also, like Sylvia, wound up being split. She had 3 siblings. The 3 siblings, the parents and her, were split between the United States and British Palestine. And she also wound up in Baltimore, also working as a seamstress. And unlike Sylvia, she did not subsequently wind up in West Virginia, but she actually stayed in Baltimore in a very heavily Jewish suburb. So that was a pretty different experience. But I was inspired by her story, the idea of, you know, having this comfortable life like so many Jewish people did in Europe before the war, and really not understanding how bad things could get until it was almost too late, or obviously for many people until it was too late. And then winding up with a very different life that you never expected in another country. So although, none of the specifics are her story, the biographical details and some of the spirit do come from her.
Abby, go ahead.
Okay, I love this story, and I was very, very emotional. And last night I was up a lot trying to figure out what spoke to me. And it wasn't so much the role of women, but the feeling of being an outsider. And I felt that a lot of the characters were outsiders. And I was thinking of different parts of my own life where maybe I did feel like an outsider and just what that feeling was and how do you assimilate. I mean, I happen to love social history, things like Newport and just especially American social history, and I just love the characters, but the emotions really, really got to me. And then I was also thinking about in terms of how we view like the people that were the diplomats that were living there, how we view them, forgetting that they're there sometimes because of their job, and we all of a sudden, attribute them to the politics and not to and make that separation, how often we do that. So my mind was going all over the place. And you did ask, if any of us had been there. I had not been there, but I realized that about 10 years ago, one of our sons was there and I knew nothing about it. And I don't even know why he was there. He's in the political world. But I remember he was very, very concerned about what to wear before in terms of the attire. And I didn't even think about it. So why does that name sound familiar? And my husband reminded me, Dave was there, many years ago, and I didn't get a chance to ask him. But I just have to tell you, first of all, what was your major in Harvard? Were you a history major or
English.
English? I mean, I love the writing, I love the characters, and I was sad that it was over, but I did like your ending.
Oh.
I like the ending. And full transparency, I have a neurodivergent son, and I'm like waiting to hear Alan's story in Israel. I really wanted to know,
Yeah.
how did he fare? Do you think there'll be a sequel to this?
I don't know about a sequel, but I also, I really strongly feel like Alan, has went on to have a happy life.
Good.
And back to the son who was worried about what to wear to the Greenbrier. They do still have a strict dress code in the dining room, so it's very old school in that way. Like, I think it's jacket and tie still for men. And I went there not too long ago with my husband and kids, and we certainly did not have the correct attire. We knew we were going into there that we did not have the correct attire, so that we were not gonna eat in the dining room, which was fine. But they still do have that rule. And I also just wanted to speak really quickly to the comment about outsiderness, and that I think was a very astute comment, because I knew at the beginning that my characters needed to be outsiders of some sort, and that I wanted to make them a family of Jewish shopkeepers. And then when I started to delve into the history of Jews in Appalachia, I learned so many interesting things, and how you might think that being Jews in Appalachia would make you sort of the ultimate outsiders, or that it would be like a very hard place. But I found in some ways that they were actually more accepted, in some of these very small towns where they were the only Jews, or one of a handful. They might have owned the only store, and they were very much sort of part of the community, but there was still always a quality of outsiderness, of being accepted, but not quite the same. And I thought that was a really interesting tension, and that I wanted to write a little bit about that. You see that in, I think, Dory, because she really wants to be an ordinary American girl, but there's still this sort of outsiderness of religion, and she's not sure how she feels about that, and how much she wants to assimilate versus retain her own history. So yeah, it was very interesting to learn the history of Jewish Appalachia, which is quite extensive.
Yeah. Wow. Lynn.
Yeah, I found it really interesting because here's Sylvia, who comes over from Poland, and she's very sheltered about her life before. And then here's Dory, who's the American daughter, and she is also very sheltered to her kids about her past. And I love that that was so real because as much as sometimes we really try to overcome our parents, it still is part of who we are. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized, here she is trying to be American, trying to separate herself from the other world, like the greenhorns, but still in her life with her children, she didn't reveal what was going on and was really closed mouth about it as much as Sylvia was about her life. So I love that you continue that character trait within the family.
Elaine, thanks for putting up the link to the Jew store. And it was called the Jew store all over. I grew up in Crystal Lake, which is outside of Chicago, and the dry goods store was owned by a Jew, the Jew store. I loved that Doreen got she kind of she got a good educational path and intellectual. I mean, I loved her story and that, she found love. While we have you, I just have to ask about um, Jack. Did you ever think about, Sylvia looking for him? Was he having affairs was he having affairs with other women? That's really the question I need to ask.
You know, I think I let that be left open in my mind because it
Yeah,
was
you
even
did.
in Sylvia's mind. He could have been anywhere from, a real sociopathic jerk to just sort of, somebody who actually liked her but wasn't, super serious. And maybe somewhere in the middle, he was, a playboy, who liked her but knew there wasn't, much of a future. I don't think Sylvia looked for him because I think she was so proud, she was like, forget this guy. She didn't even want to take the money, she wanted to just pretend it never happened. So,
I was also happy that Lewis found love later in life. I mean, there was so many redeeming things, but for Doreen and Peter to lose their mom, I mean, I think in that day and age, today, you can call. If you're in Israel, it's you FaceTime you whatever, but now, they never saw him. Do you imagine that Alan saw Doreen and that they, had a reunion or Jordan and Jessica?
yeah, I like to think for sure that they did. I think that at the end, Doreen was already envisioning it, that she was already making plans for it. And and I was thinking exactly what you said. I was thinking a lot about how, when you immigrated, that was that was it. I mean, you could write letters, but you might never go back, or never even see the place where you had grown up. And I was writing this. I wrote the initial draft when I was living in Hong Kong, where I lived for a decade during the pan. It was well, I lived there for a decade, and I wrote this during the pandemic when we couldn't travel home. Normally, we would go back to the U.S. twice a year, and because of the pandemic, we couldn't travel for 2.5 years. They effectively closed the border in Hong Kong, so I was able to just, see my parents on FaceTime, and they were able to watch my kids grow. And it wasn't the same, but it made me think a lot about what it must have been like for my grandmother, who, separated from her own parents, and really the only thing she ever heard from them again was, probably a few airmail letters, and just how impossible it was to imagine that. So, um,
I also thought it was very realistic. Doreen married somebody Jewish, and Doreen knew how important it was to her father because she loved well whatever she wasn't going to get married to Tony, and she found her husband later. But Peter, they married non-Jews. Can you talk a little bit maybe about the Jewish community in the South? And the realistic, part of that and why you went in that direction.
yeah, I I wanted to show a story of somebody who had like a happy love ending that didn't involve them marrying their first love. Um, and Tony was, he was a nice guy. He was a decent guy. They had a wonderful love affair. She lost her virginity to him. They, you know, had like a very beautiful relationship, and he inspired her to become more than she thought she could become. But she didn't have to marry him. You know, I wanted to show that she could have all that and she still didn't have to marry him. She could still make a different choice. And she made that choice for a variety of reasons, you know, one of which was that she realized that it was important to her to keep the kind of Jewish chain like her grandfather had talked about. Um, but I also wanted to show, you know, that her brother made a different choice and that that was also okay. And he was still like a loved member of the family. And I think in the South, it would have been very interesting because if you were in the situation that someone like Dory or Pete were in, where you were essentially the only Jewish family for, you know, an hour or two in any direction, you would usually do one of two things. One was that you would have become part of an informal matchmaking situation where there were matchmakers throughout the rural South who knew where people lived, and they'd say, "Oh, you know, I got a girl over here and a boy, you know, like 150 miles this way, and I think it could be a good match." That's actually my stepfather is from Danville, Virginia, and his parents, who were also from the rural South, they were matched that way. They're both sort of, I think, getting on in years, which meant they were probably, oh, I don't know, 29. And the matchmaker matched them like from different towns in rural Virginia. This would have been, I guess, the 40s. And then the other choice was that you would be sent to a bigger city that was adjacent, like Baltimore. Baltimore was sort of the big city for a lot of people in Appalachia. Cincinnati was another one for the other people living on the other side of Appalachia. So you'd be sent to one of those places to make a match there. So those were the two choices. And then, of course, you know, some people intermarried, like Jews have always done.
Sue, go ahead.
Okay, I really enjoyed reading this book. And one of the things I liked about it and that I just touched my heart so was reading about Saul.
Mm.
Um, the things that he did just reminded me so much of my own family and how they came to this country. Uh, my Zadie brought my father when my dad was only 6 years old. They came from, actually, they came from Kiev, which is so much in the news these days. But they landed, they came on the Bremen, just as Sal did, and they landed in Baltimore. Never came through Ellis Island like so many did. So when I was reading about that, it just touched my heart because it was so much like what my home family had to go through.
Yeah,
So there's just so much about this that we can all identify with.
absolutely. Uh, I thought that the scene where Doreen catches, you know, the popular girl in a lesbian romantic liaison, do you think, uh, you know, and that was like in 1959, right? When she caught her. So, and you know, Doreen didn't know what was happening, which I think is totally realistic. You know, our kids today, they, you know, Google everything and they're on the computer and they, you know, they can ask questions and find out instantly and not always in a good way. How did you why did you include that scene? And tell us more.
Well, I think I wanted to explore the idea that, you know, Doreen saw Patty, her friend, as the ultimate sort of insider, and yet she didn't know what was in her heart and why Patty might be actually thinking of herself as very much an outsider in this other way. Um, And, some people have asked, like, would it have been realistic for, someone to pursue a lesbian affair in rural West Virginia? And, I think these things have always happened. And also, I want the character of Patty was sort of she was a strong-willed person. She wasn't, an ordinary person, but I think, the people have always pursued what they're drawn to, even when they didn't have words for it. And I just, I wanted to put that in there to show just the various ways that somebody can be both an insider and an outsider at the same time.
My heart sank for Doreen when she broke the puzzle box and was discovered. But my heart soared when she told Junior off and said, I'm stopping this. And then I also thought at the end, the last chapters that kind of of each of the main characters, he was, I don't know if he was redeemed. Yeah, I felt a scotch more sympathetic because as you're reading the book, you're just so mad at him and what he's doing, and then explaining that it wasn't him. He didn't beat up Alan, it was those other kids. And I thought that was uh it's like a good twist. I just all of that I really liked. Um
Well,
Go ahead.
I'll tell you a sort of funny story, which is that a couple months ago, I got an email from a woman in West Virginia whose last name is Carper, just like Junior and his family. And she was very angry because she said, you used my family as the villains. And obviously, I don't know her family. I used the last name because it's a common last name in that part of the world. And I pulled all the names from, like I looked at names that were common from old records. But what I wanted to tell her was that they weren't really all the villains. The grandfather certainly was, but the father, the one who interacted with Sylvia, the one who is the guard, he was a kind person who, tried his best to warn her, even though he came off, sort of like an idiot. He was, essentially a nice person. And then the son, I wanted to show that people can behave in these atrocious ways and that they can be redeemed, or that we can understand the reasons why they behave in these ways. We can look
Right.
back at Junior and go, well, he was blackmailing Dory. That was a horrible thing, but he was also, like a poor, despised hillbilly kid who had a pregnant girlfriend and no money and, did a terrible thing, but that's not the only part of him that there is. So, um,
I mean,
yeah,
he really, committed to Shuva, and then when he writes he gets Jordan to come down there, and it's Jordan's big break. I mean, that all of that interconnectedness, I really, really like. I also appreciated, and now I can't remember, but we find out that Cricket, who is kind of all, all through the story, that she loved a black man and, but they won't let her do that. Did you think about bringing in any other racial stories, or because I'm sure racism was a big part of Appalachia and South and everything.
yeah, absolutely. And you're right. I didn't go into it a ton, but there certainly Greenbrier County was. There's some parts of Appalachia that are not that racially diverse, but Greenbrier County is. There was always a sizable Black population there, and it was, one of the places that had to be desegregated by court order. And I think that would have happened not long before Dory, well, probably when Dory was starting high school.
Hmm.
Um, and although I didn't go into it a ton, the relationship between these Jewish shopkeepers and the Black people in these towns was an interesting thing because, you know, this is not to say that Jews didn't often share some of the racial prejudices of other white people in America, but I think sometimes there was more perspective on it, especially if they weren't from the South. And Saul, went out of his way to make sure that, his store was always open to everybody. And from what I read of Jewish shopkeepers and Jews in rural Appalachia, that was fairly true because not only did they not come from the South, they also it was good business
Yes.
to not exclude people. So there did develop some bonds between the Black community and these small Jewish communities in these towns.
Mhm. Andy, go ahead.
Emily, I have major compliments and then a question. I listened to the book twice on Audible because I enjoyed it so much. And I thought the book was terrific. I think the characters were so beautifully developed
Yeah.
in so many ways. And here's my question, sometimes I really related to Sylvia, and at times I was like, girlfriend, you've got it so lucky. You've got a nice husband. You've got a baby. You have a decent mother-in-law. You don't have to work that hard. And what are you doing? Why are you risking so much? And I know she had a lot of emotional trauma and baggage, and we all take it out differently. But I wanted a little more thoughts from you about her complexity.
Yeah, I think Sylvia was somebody who had a life that was good in many ways. And at the beginning, she's sort of berating herself because she knows she should be happy. There's a war on, but she's safe and she's, got a nice husband and she's got a baby and she's got a store and they've got enough to eat, but she's still so unhappy. And part of that, I think, is that she's depressed. She's depressed. She's been through this trauma that she has, really no way of talking about or putting into words. And I think she's just also a person who wants something more and different. And even if she should be happy with what she has, she's not a person who's going to be. So, we have Pauline, her mother-in-law, who, was also a city girl from a more well-to-do family who was, pretty upset to find herself in rural West Virginia with a husband she didn't know that well. But because of temperamental differences, it was okay for her, but it wasn't okay for Sylvia, and that's just the kind of person she was. So yeah, she makes these terrible decisions, and you want to say be satisfied, but she just can't.
Andy, I usually agree with you, but if Pauline was my mother-in-law,
I
she
know she was
she drove me
so
nuts.
critical. She was so critical
Yeah, yeah,
of
and
her. And
yeah,
and I guess when you live in such a close-knit environment too,
yeah,
the
yeah,
same, basically the same household,
yeah.
one kitchen, and
Right. And she won't let her cook, and it just goes on and on. I thought
totally.
when Sylvia was trying to abort the baby, I thought that was again, I assume you had to do research in all of this of, birth control, abortion. Um, we're living in a fraught time right now, but when abortion is not legal, women die. And, you implied that that's what some women would risk and do if they really, had to get rid of or wanted to get rid of the baby.
Yeah, and when people talk about, abortion, whether it should be legal or illegal, what what pro-choice people will often say is that women have always had abortions. Women have always, no matter whether it was legal, no matter what they had to do, like this is something that women have always done in every culture in the world, sometimes at great risk. And yeah, I did do research, and there were these granny women, they called them in the South, who were sort of, herbal midwives, and they would also often facilitate abortions, not super effectively, as we saw with Sylvia. It didn't work, but women have always done what they could to try to take control in any way that they could, no matter what was, legal or allowed or, or accepted.
Hmm. Was it easy to do research on the whole secret of the Greenbrier? And I mean, you're a journalist, but where did you look to get those answers?
Yeah, fortunately, there's a lot of really good sources. There is the Greenbrier itself had for many years, like 40 years, its own historian, a guy
Mhm.
called Bob Conti, and he wrote a book about the Greenbrier, which had a lot of pictures and a lot of details. Um, and then the period of time where it was a detention center is described in a book called Such Splendid Prisons that talks about the three hotels. And that's written by a guy called Harvey Solomon, who's a historian, I think, in Washington, D.C. So I read that. There's a few other books that it's mentioned in. Um, so yeah, and then all the original articles from when it became known to the public, those are all
Mhm.
there, and there's plenty of analysis about that. So
And
I
I think you mentioned the reporter who was the reporter who uncovered it? Just a
Yeah,
guy?
so the reporter who uncovered it is actually a Jewish guy from Southern Ohio named Ted Gupp. And I think he's retired now. And he, had gotten an anonymous letter just like Jordan did and had gone to investigate. And it was very clear that people were lying.
Mm.
But he wrote the story anyway. And after the story came out, they had to admit it and they had to decommission the bunker. And some people in White Sulphur Springs were very angry at him because they said, "Look, we are the townspeople who have protected this secret, and here you are, some big city journalist coming in and blowing it all up. You shouldn't have done that." But a
Mm.
lot of people also thought it was the government shouldn't be spending all that money on something that could really never be used for the purpose that it was created for.
Right. And I thought that, and now I can't remember if it was in the afterwards, but like, when the nuclear weapons, there would have been enough time to come from DC to West Virginia. Now
No.
there would not be. And so until the 90s, they were swapping out food every 3 months. That was
Yeah.
still going on. That's just mind
Yep.
blowing
Hmm.
that, you know, talk about government waste. Um, Secrets play a significant role in the narrative. How do you think these secrets shape the characters' relationships and their understandings of themselves and each other? And did you purposely have each generation have a secret?
Yeah, the whole book was inspired by the idea of secrecy, this town keeping a secret. So there's a secret at the center of the book, and then I wanted to give every generation a secret, and secrets that to some extent built on the secrets of the prior generation. So every decision that the one generation makes to keep a secret has these impacts on the next generation. So, you can see Sylvia's decisions playing out in her daughter,
Yeah.
and then those decisions spur Dory's decisions, which then create the childhood that Jordan had, which,
Yes.
gives Jordan this burning desire to be the uncoverer of secrets.
Yeah.
So I did want to give everybody both their own secrets and the sort of generational burden of
Right.
secret keeping.
Yeah. Um, Jordan reminded me a little bit of Alan, even though Alan, was only a half brother, but there was just something I don't know why. Was that purposeful or that was just me?
Yeah, I think I don't know if that's something I thought about or not, but they definitely had this sort of nerdy and obsessive quality and like a real
Right,
sweetness to them.
right, right. Um, what do you define as Appalachia? So, like it's I've read there's a lot of books about, the library woman who goes around in Appalachia. I can't think of the book.
Yeah.
Lindsay, think of the name of the book. But so exactly where is it? would you say?
Yeah, so Appalachia, I think technically begins like in Georgia, although some people would say even part of Alabama, and then goes all the way up to Maine. But when
Oh,
people talk about Appalachia, they are often talking about Southern Appalachia, which would be West Virginia is the only state that's entirely within Appalachia, but like Eastern Tennessee, Western North Carolina, part
mhm,
of North Western Georgia would all
mhm,
be part of that Southern Appalachian region. That's sort of the quintessential sort of stereotypical Appalachia.
mhm.
Um, Although, when you travel further north, some of those regions, in places like Pennsylvania and New York, still have a lot culturally in common and still have a lot
Yeah,
of the same poverty.
yeah, poverty. Um, what were some of the most challenging aspects of writing in the Shadow of Greenbrier, and how did you overcome them?
Well, one challenging aspect was that I had planned to go do research in person because it had been 15 years since I had visited, but because of the pandemic and the borders being closed, I was not able to. So I did all of my initial research, through secondary sources, and I read the books that I talked about, but I wanted to make it realistic in a way that somebody who knew the Greenbrier would say, oh yeah, this is what it feels like to be inside. So I was looking at floor plans and looking at maps of the region and going like, okay, if I'm in the dining room and I turn right, like where does that take me? And that would have been a lot easier to do in person, but I couldn't. So fortunately we have the internet, which I don't
Yes.
know how anyone ever wrote a book before that.
Exactly. How has the reception of the novel been? And what do you hope readers take away from your story?
Yeah, it's the reception has been very
Besides the lady who was mad about you using her
Yeah.
family name.
I know, I feel bad. No, the reception has been really, really neat because depending on where I've been, either physically or on Zoom, I've talked to people, some people who know the Greenbrier really well. I've done in-person talks in West Virginia. I've done Zoom talks with book groups in West Virginia. So I've talked to people who are like, oh, I am the fourth generation in my family to work at the Greenbrier, and like they were showing up at my reading, and that was so cool. And a lot of them said that it really like it captured it, things like the employee Christmas party, and that I was very pleased about because I no matter what, I'm not going to know as much about this place as these people who have grown up around it for generations. And then even, when I would be somewhere pretty far away, like California, I would sometimes meet somebody who said, oh, like back in 1968, like my husband worked for a pharmaceutical company and we went on a conference to the Greenbrier. So that was really fun too. And in terms of what I hope people take away, I mean, that's such a good question. We're living in such fraught times, and you know, I I think despite some of the, bad things that happen in the book, what you do have at the end of the day is, people from pretty diverse backgrounds making a community and caring for something together. And I want to think that that's still possible. So I hope that's, something that people do take away.
Um, I was sure, and I don't know why my mind went this way, that Alan and Sylvia had died. So when I found out they were safe in Israel, I was
Yeah.
happy. Very, very happy.
I said at the beginning, I told my husband, I said, no, no children are gonna die in this book. Like I will turn the TV off like when that happens, like on
Yes.
a,
Yeah.
so
Good. Excellent. And I'll ask for more questions in a hot minute, but I would be remiss if I did not say, what are you working on now?
yeah, that's a very pertinent question because I'm just doing a final round of edits on my second book, which will be out in April of next year, and it's called The Lost Girl of Craven County. It's set in the town of New Bern in near coastal North Carolina, so my home state, and it's about a Jewish family during the Great Depression that run a pickle warehouse in New Bern, and the daughter of the family is a 25-year-old old maid in the Jewish community that they call Little Jerusalem there, which was a real designation. She gets into a bit of a mystery. So it's historical fiction, Great Depression, Jewish, and some mystery and adventure in there. So I'm hoping it'll be a fun read.
It sounds great because I work hard to find different authors and books, but we have so many Holocaust books that so the Depression, we haven't read a lot of Depression books, so that hopefully that's a good thing. I had one other question and now it other questions, ladies. Anything else we want to ask? Well, we thank you. We love the book. We'll look out for your new book because it sounds great. And
Have
uh,
a title yet?
I'm sorry, what?
It's
Have
called
the-
it's called The Lost Girl of Craven County.
Okay.
Can't pre-order it yet.
Not yet, but soon. I think probably maybe at the end of the summer.
Okay. Yay. I know what my question was. Do you have any influence on the Audible narrators?
So when they were going to do the Audible edition, they sent me four sound files and asked me if I had any opinions. And one of the narrators was a man, and I knew it needed to be a woman. And then of the three remaining ones, I just liked Jilly, the narrator, who happens to be Israeli American. I just liked her voice. I didn't know anything about her, but I liked her voice. So. To be perfectly honest, I can't listen to the Audible edition. There's something about like listening to what I wrote that puts me in an awkward state, like listening to my own voice or something, even though it's not
That
me.
makes such sense because she didn't mispronounce anything. I usually read and do Audible, and when in the Audible they mispronounce the Hebrew, every time they do it, I correct them like they could hear me. So, and I thought her Sylvia her accents were good. She was great. She was,
God.
all right, ladies. This is our last book till August. You know where to get a hold of me. And this was just great. It was great meeting you, and we look forward to your next book.
Well,
Yes.
thank you so much. It was so nice
Thank
to be
you.
here.
All
Have a
right.
good
so
night.
much.
Vanessa.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.